it feels like a rift is opening up in the land of conservatives, and some people would call Tucker Carlson the catalyst for that rift. However, some of those same people would vote for Vice President J.D. Vance if he were running for president tomorrow. But did you know that Tucker and Vance are actually connected? I would say deeply connected in some ways. If you are ready to be shocked, we're going to show you how. Here's the obvious connection point right here is that Tucker Carlson's son Buckley is joining JD Vance's staff. This happened in the beginning of 2025 during the inauguration of Trump. Suddenly Vance picked up some more staff. Tucker Carlson's son was one of them. So he is the currently still the press secretary for Vance. It could be a random political connection, right? Because people know each other and whatever. He's good at what he does. But there's some other connections as well. If you didn't know, JD Vance actually used to be what many would consider a never Trumper. So he's very vocally outspoken against Trump, very anti-Trump in a lot of ways, especially during Trump's first campaign for his first term. And even after that, all of a sudden, it seems like Vance switched sides. Well, there's somebody else that switched sides all of a sudden, seemingly overnight, and that is Tucker Carlson. He used to work for CNN as a commentator for many years. He also worked for MSNBC. And we were supposed to believe that he suddenly switched from being a liberal political commentator to a conservative voice. That's very strange. That's kind of hard to swallow once you actually look into his history. The American conservative. So if y'all have ever heard of this, I don't recommend it after reading some of their articles. Here's some articles they recently put out about Mamdani. So most people know that Zohran Mamdani was elected as mayor of New York City. One article titled, "No, Zohran Mamdani isn't a third worldist." And this article has picked up a lot of flack on X specifically for being what people would call a defense for Mamdani. I will be fair and say it's not a full defense and they don't completely paint him as a shining star, but it doesn't sound very conservative when you actually read the article. It sounds a little bit more liberal than conservative. Here's another one down here, the great Mamdani freakout. Kind of asking that question, why are we freaking out about this guy? And my responsibility, well, for good reason. We did a whole episode about Mamdani.
I think it's one thing to try to be like in the middle of the lane and be like, okay, let's not jump to conclusions or whatever. But it's another thing to actually see somebody who's very, very clearly a leftist and kind of pretend like it's not that big of a deal. Those are two different things.
Right. And so here's one thing from this article. No, Zohran Mamdani isn't a third worldist. One of the quotes from the article is what he is. So they say he's not a third worldist, which I think there's some pushback that could happen there. I think they're partially correct about that. And they do make some distinctions that are good. But they also say what he is woke. And then you would expect them to completely condemn him based on his wokeness. But here's what they do instead. They say woke has some similarities with third worldism, but it is mainly a domestic phenomenon and not connected to any geopolitical struggle. So they get technical about it, and kind of just paint it as like, it is what it is. Then they say it does have a meaning. It's the belief that America is beset by systematic inequalities that require dramatic measures to overcome. They just made that sound as good as freaking possible in my mind. And I'm like, that's not what most conservatives consider woke. Most conservatives, if there's a systematic inequality, most conservatives, especially Christian conservatives, are going to be fighting against that, in my mind. Yeah. It's not the liberals that are fighting against that. In my mind, they're actually creating inequalities when they think that they're fighting against them. Yet they try to redefine wokeism and make it sound as good as possible, to me as a conservative. I'm like,
require dramatic measures to overcome. That is the kindest way to say acts of terror. Basically, that is how far you can take that. That is such a vague statement. What are those dramatic measures? Please elaborate.
It may be no shock to find out that you actually go look at who's behind the American conservative. You've got their staff, right? And you go all the way down to the bottom. Tucker Carlson is listed on their advisory board. So he's directly connected and advising the direction of the American conservative. What does this have to do with Vance? You're going to hear a message from our sponsor, and then in a few minutes, I'm actually going to connect Vance to the agenda behind the American conservative that I believe Tucker Carlson is fueling. Investing can be confusing and scary, but it doesn't have to be. Genesis Gold Group takes the guessing out of the game and guides you on your gold investment journey. We at Filibusted love the genius design of the Prepper Bar, which breaks up into sections, kind of like a chocolate bar. But if you prefer high security insured gold storage, they have that too. And unlike Fort Knox, the gold is actually there, 100% owned by you. So don't wait to get started. Visit filibustedgold.com today for a free investment guide from Genesis Gold Group. So in a couple minutes, we're going to show you how this agenda that Tucker Carlson is seemingly fueling is connected to Vance, potentially as the next president. But before we do that, I want to jump into some of Tucker's other strange connections and some of the red flags that are raised. So Doug, I know you've done some research in this area. So what have you got?
So, okay, first of all, when we talk about people's connections, it's important to note that these are not, it's not damning evidence. When I look at these things, I'm not saying, oh, for sure, now he's part of this club or that club or whatever. But there is still the concept of, birds of a feather kind of thing. Like he has a tendency to hang out with certain individuals that are questionable. There also is the idea that obviously he does a lot of interviews with people, and that should not be condemned either, because in order to get a very balanced view of the entire world, you probably should interview people that maybe you wouldn't agree with. So I get all of that. However, some of these relationships go a little bit deeper than just an interview now and then, and even some of the interviews are questionable too. The first one up is a name that maybe not many people know, or maybe more do than I realize, but his name is Mitch Horowitz, which there's nothing wrong with this dude. I actually have a lot of respect for this guy. I think that he does some very interesting research, but at the end of the day, Mitch Horowitz is an occultist, and he says that himself. He's kind of like white magic occultist, basically. So he was a former editor and colleague with Tucker Carlson. In their college days, they attempted to write a book together, but they never got it finished. And Horowitz was brought up in an interview recently. In this article here, the interview was between Conrad Flynn and Tucker Carlson. Flynn suggested that he said something about like, well, you were connected with Mitch Horowitz, and Carlson was like, oh yeah, like let's not talk too much about that. Basically, he dismissed it very quickly. But I will say that Flynn misrepresented Horowitz a little bit, and by saying that he was a Satanist. But the fact is that, well, maybe not the fact, but from my perspective, Horowitz isn't a Satanist. He's actually quite the inverted version of that, which we talked about in a different video. I can't remember which video, but like the difference between Satanism and Luciferianism.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't.
The Brett Cooper video. Yeah.
He wouldn't call himself a Luciferian probably, but his ideals align more closely to the Enlightenment kind of mentality, basically. And Carlson dismissed this. And so on the surface, you might think, well, okay, that's just kind of odd. And even I have read some of Mitch Horowitz's stuff, and I have read a lot of these things. I've gotten into this research, but there's a big difference between researching it and actually trying to put this white magic into practice. And Mitch Horowitz teaches how to do that.
Wow.
That is one of his sources of income, I believe. Well, he might not get paid for it, but like that's a thing of his. That's what he does. So the next one up is Hunter Biden, which is a fun one. They used to be neighbors. There's a big scandal about their email communications. Carlson got into deep water when he was accused of leveraging his relationship with Hunter Biden to get his son into a fancy university.
Wow.
Carlson claims it was Russian propaganda, but there are a lot of different articles covering this in multiple different ways from various different angles, and they all align with each other. So I don't know. We'll let our viewers be the judge on whether or not there's anything there for that. So next up is his most famous one recently, the Nick Fuentes interview that he did, and we covered that one as well. And basically he just gave Fuentes a platform and didn't challenge him hardly at all, and it looked like a father welcoming a son, and like
he challenged a few things, and I'm grateful for the few pushbacks that he gave, and we said that in the response video that we made to that interview. But looking back and now knowing a lot more about Nick Fuentes than I did at the time, I would say he didn't push back near enough. It did seem more of a open arms situation than it did a pushback.
It was very warm and fuzzy feeling. Right. And it made Nick Fuentes out to look a whole lot better than he really was. And since then, same here. I've done a lot more research and seen more things come out about Nick Fuentes. And I was trying to give the dude what's the word I'm looking for?
Benefit of the doubt.
Benefit of the doubt. Yeah. Since then, I'm like, no, this guy's bad.
No, I can't either. He's horrible. I think Nick Fuentes needs to be shut down. And if I could, I would pull the plug on his program.
Tucker Carlson did an interview with Conor McGregor, which is no big deal, but they happened to do it in a Freemason lodge.
Oh.
Which is fascinating. The lodge since has come out and said that they regret letting them use it, but the reason why they regret letting them use it is because the Freemasons are pretty secretive about their lodges. They were supposed to blur out the background and make it not obvious that they were in a Freemason lodge, and they did not do that.
Wow.
They just let it all hang out there. Obviously, this is very clearly a Freemason lodge. Anybody who's even researched a tiny bit about this would recognize that immediately.
Yeah, the checkered floor. Mm-hmm. The pyramids above the doors.
They did this whole interview, and Carlson's team is the one that actually rented this place. At the end of this interview, gave him a little Freemason handshake right there.
Wow.
So just putting it right in our faces. And one could argue that the handshake was simple and that is a mere accident that he happened to do the whole thumb on top with the finger out pinched like that onto Tucker Carlson. And it doesn't necessarily mean that Tucker Carlson or Conor McGregor is a Freemason, but this is just very odd looking. Like, why
It is
would you do
odd.
this in a Freemason lodge in front of everybody? Like, that's just odd to me. But that is a legitimate Freemason handshake. And yes, Freemason handshakes are real. There's another article from a Freemason site that literally breaks down what the handshakes mean. So it's like, I'm not making this up. A lot of people think that they're not real is what I'm saying. I think, oh, that's just a mythology.
Right. No,
It's
they
not
are.
mythology.
Yeah.
They're very real. Why would they do this in Dublin, Ireland? That's a big city. I'm sure there were other venues available.
Sure.
But they chose this one. Tucker Carlson's team chose to do this here. So those are his strange connections that require at least a little bit of critical thinking, I would say.
Some people are wondering, well, what's the connection between this rift that Tucker's creating and Vance? Well, let's go back to the American conservative, which I don't think is very American or conservative, but not very pro-American anyways. Here's an article that they released on November 6th. So this was just this year, very recently. JD Vance can lead a post-Israel America. Here's the subtitle. As the right fragments, the vice president enters the spotlight. I want to read a couple quotes from this article, and then I want to give you my conclusion. You may land on a different opinion if you go read these articles and do the research yourself, but this is what it says. In reaction, Israel and its American supporters have sought to shore up the special relationship, talking about the special relationship between America and Israel. It says, by ostracizing Israel-critical voices. Their latest target, Kevin Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation, who recently expressed support for Tucker Carlson, MAGA's most prominent critic of Israel. Interesting. They reference Tucker Carlson again in this article. In most of their articles, they're talking about Tucker Carlson. I'll just say that. And Israel, based on how many articles I've read. I haven't read all the articles. Luckily for Republicans, one politician who can strike a balance between these factions and finesse the transition to what I call a post-Israel GOP is the party's presumptive nominee for president in 2028, Vice President JD Vance. So they are proposing Vance as the solution to the rift that, in my opinion, Tucker Carlson is helping to fuel on the right. Here's my question. Tucker Carlson, a known liberal, a voice on CNN, MSNBC, having his own shows, his own commentary shows, and then switching to the conservative side, becoming a conservative seemingly overnight. Vance, an anti-Trumper, eventually joining Trump's team. Is this a setup? It sounds like it. Like it almost sounds like even this article, if you read through it, it says, listen to what it says, but it's necessary to do so to maintain the proper focus on Mamdani and not allow concern over him to justify unquestionable support for Israel. So even this article goes back to, we shouldn't support Israel. It's like, you're talking about Mamdani. Like, we're not talking about Israel, right?
Yeah.
This whole thing feels like propaganda. Now, I'll say this much. I'm not 100% in support of everything Israel's government does or everything Netanyahu does. I support Israel personally, but I think as a supporter of Israel, I should be allowed to critique Israel and even critique some of the ways America supports Israel, okay? And some of the connections there, right? And I think there's people that can be high up in our government that are making bad decisions. There can be people high up in Israeli government that are making bad decisions. And that doesn't mean that I don't support America anymore or that I can't support Israel, right? To an extent. I'm not trying to blindly support Israel, but at the same time, I think it's very clear that this is a very anti-Israel. They're essentially expanding a rift and a problem in order to bring the solution. And it's obvious what they're saying is the solution is Vance, right? So is this all a setup? Like we're going to exacerbate a problem so we can bring the solution, the perfect plot, to get Vance elected.
Well, that sounds like the Hegelian dialect for sure, which is something that we see used over and over and over again. Make the problem, present the solution, and then ta-da, your goals are achieved. I think that we have an interesting thing happening in this country, an interesting paradigm where we have like mass amnesia. Because I remember that weird transition of Tucker Carlson when he became overnight conservative. And I remember thinking like, well, this is odd. Why all of a sudden are all us conservatives behind this dude when he was just talking smack about us? Mm-hmm. I don't get it. And I just kind of moved on and thought, okay, well, I guess, everybody's allowed to change their mind, which obviously I still agree with. But I find it interesting that it's happening with very important people and prominent influencers or people who are being brought into that position, like JD Vance. I want to believe that it's as simple as they just, saw the light or whatever, and that they're like, oh, you know what, I've been wrong. Like, forgive me for being wrong. I'm turning from that, and I now know better. You never really hear quite that extreme of an opinion voice. So like, for example, when Trump was running the first time, 2016, well, not the first, but when he was running in 2016, I remember before that, I was like, dude, I don't know about this guy because, it's Trump. And I was not like so on board, but I didn't have a great reason until I started looking into it. And then the more I looked into it, the more I was like, oh no, Trump is definitely the guy we need for this country. So at first I was not for Trump, but I just did a little bit of research and came around to it, right? Well, I wasn't not for Trump for the massive laundry list of reasons that JD Vance and Tucker Carlson were. They made it very clear how much they did not like either Trump or the conservative base. And then all of a sudden they decided that they were just going to forget all about that and move on. I don't know. That's questionable to me. There's something up with that.
I think this is something that we're going to be talking about in the future as well, doing some more episodes about, maybe diving a little bit deeper, and we'll see what we find. So thank you all for joining us. Gold is not just a backup plan if the world falls apart. It's an investment opportunity that could set you up for generations. There's never really a bad time to invest in gold, but you want to make sure you have the right guide, and that is where Genesis Gold Group shines. Whether you are a first-time buyer or a seasoned investor, their trusted expertise and competitive pricing makes them an easy choice. They offer tangible assets in case of emergencies, but they can also design the perfect IRA just for you. And they'll even cut through all that confusing red tape from the IRS. We at Filibusted love the genius design of the Prepper Bar, which breaks up into sections like a chocolate bar. But if you prefer a more high-security insured gold storage, they have that too. And unlike Fort Knox, the gold is actually there and 100% owned by you. Genesis Gold Group is a safe, simple, and convenient way to invest. Visit filibustedgold.com today for your free investment guide from Genesis Gold Group.